Hello everybody and welcome to Saturday evening at Gŵyl Festival. I hope you're all having a lovely day. With me tonight I have Polly Barton, who is a translator and currently based in, are you based in Bristol or London at the moment?
That's right, in Bristol, yeah.
Do you know, we're just across the border. I'm just in Chepstow, like literally across the bridge.
Oh wow, okay. I'll wave to you across the across the ocean.
So Polly translates from Japanese to English, and I found her through the book Where the Wild Ladies Are, and we want to talk a little bit about that. Also, hello Aiko, I know that you are hopefully watching, hello, she wrote the book, in case anyone didn't catch her. I was just wondering a little bit about how you became a translator. So how did you start translating, and why literary fiction in particular, as opposed to audiovisual interpreting, all those kind of things?
Sure. Well, I guess the very first time I started translating was when I was working in a London-based publisher of it was mostly food-related texts, and I was asked to translate a food blog, and you know, that was back in the days when my Japanese really wasn't all that hot, but I think that even though I was kind of looking up every other word, I more or less immediately had the sense that this was something that kind of worked for me, that it was quite a good fit with my skill set. I guess I've always been a very bookish person, and you know, translating felt, the more I did it, the more I started to feel like it was a kind of a very deep way of reading, which really appealed. And then also getting to use like my English really felt good as well. In terms of interpreting, I feel like it's a very, very different skill set. And you know, often when people are dealing with you as a translator, the assumption is like, if you can do one, then you can do the other. And you know, both interpreters and translators will tell you very with a lot of passion that that's not the case. You know, one of my most dreaded things is when I'm kind of suddenly called upon to like interpret, and I think as the years have gone on, I got slightly more confident with it, but you know, essentially I'm an introvert, and speaking is not my forte, as this is bearing witness to. So yeah, translating I feel a lot more at home with, I guess.
I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about Where the Wild Ladies Are and introduce it. I thought it was absolutely delightful and quite a surprise. So
thank you. So Where the Wild Ladies Are is a collection of contemporary feminist reimaginings of traditional Japanese ghost stories, which kind of have multiple sources. You know, some of them are kind of the kind of ghost stories that are essentially passed down as part of the culture. Other ones, and that everyone would know. Other ones are slightly less well known, and you know, appear in like kabuki or rakugo, which are kind of traditional Japanese storytelling forms. But one kind of very notable feature of the quintessential Japanese ghost story is that the ghost is always a woman, and the woman has become a ghost because they have some kind of grudge or grievance that they've been unable to leave behind, right? So they kind of come back to avenge the people who have wronged them. And so it's a very sort of sad picture, essentially, of a woman who's had a terrible lot in life, and she's come back, and you know, she's a real drag, and she's trying to kind of people would rather forget her, essentially, right? And Aiko has told me in the past that she has this real fascination for ghosts, but not just for ghosts who are kind of scary and menacing, but more for ghosts that kind of just blend in very naturally with the people around them. And, you know, where no one really kind of questions their presence. And so a lot of the ghosts in these stories are very much like that. They don't find it weird that they're around in the world, and occasionally, you know, some people do find it strange, but more often than not, they just kind of blend in, and notably, they are a lot more sorted than most of the kind of human inhabitants of the world, I would say. You know, they have a lot to teach us, essentially.
Absolutely, I think it's a version of retelling ghost stories or horror stories or fairy tales in a feminist way that I've never come across before, because you sort of have your Angela Carters and like, I love them, they're amazing, but this is something really new. They're quite interlinked stories, so I didn't read them originally in chronological order, so it took me a bit longer than I think other people to realize that there were characters who were reoccurring and that there was a theme. And I was wondering, how was that to translate? Did you sort of do it to the same extent? Is it the same thing in the Japanese, or like, did you have to sort of change that at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much as it is in the Japanese. I think in the English edition, the order is very slightly changed. The order of the story is very slightly changed. And when we were reordering, then we had to be very careful that that wasn't disrupted, because I think one of the joys for me about this collection actually was that they are interlinked, but not in a very obvious way, even if you are reading them in the kind of the prescribed order. And so I remember too, as well, the first time I read it, like kind of thinking, I remember that name, like, and then kind of gradually it starts to all fall into place. But that too feels, if not kind of ghostly, at least a little bit, you know, it contributes to this sense that is going on throughout the book, I think, of like never quite being on a firm footing with what is going on, right? So yeah, that felt like an important feature to me too. I'm glad that you appreciated that.
How did you come to work with Aiko? Have you worked with her before, or was this a new, did you pitch the book, or did the publisher come to you asking for translation?
So it's been a kind of long and quite, not, I wouldn't say convoluted, but certainly not straightforward path. I mean, I knew of Aiko's, I've known of Aiko's work for a long time, but the first time that we ever worked together, I was about to say, although at that time we hadn't met, the first work that I ever translated by her was a short story in that collection called Smartening Up. And I was asked to translate that for the Granta Japan edition that came out. I can't remember when it was issued. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, 2005 maybe. And at that time, Where the Wild Ladies Are didn't exist as a collection, and I had no idea that this was going to become that. I don't know if Aiko had an idea at that stage. Anyway, I translated it and it went online for Granta, and I loved it so much that I sort of started investigating other Aiko's work and sort of reaching out to her. So I translated a few other stories by her, and then at that kind of quite coincidentally, me and her both ended up doing a residency at the same time in Norwich, where we kind of got a lot closer. And it was around that time that we met up with Deborah Smith from tiltedaxis, and we kind of came up with a plan, the three of us, to do something. And that's, you know, that's finally the fruition of that.
Have you translated, so just a little bit about tiltedaxis, they're wonderful publishers, and Deborah Smith is actually the translator of The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which is a Korean book, which I'm sure most people will have heard of. And have you worked for tiltedaxis? So they exclusively publish Asian literature, and there's a really good, I don't have it in my room at the moment, but there's a lovely poetry book I love, the Meets Bacchus one.
Yes, that's
so
fantastic. That's really, really great.
Sergius Meets Bacchus, that's it. But anyway, sorry, have you worked with Deborah before, and are you going to do it for translators other than Aiko, or are you just going to stick with?
I have not worked with Deborah before, and actually, so Where the Wild Ladies Are is only the second book in Japanese that they have published. The first one being Tokyo Ueno Station by Morgan, translated by Morgan Giles, written by Yu Miri, which is also fantastic. But so yes, so no, that was my first time to work with tiltedaxis, and I don't really know what the future is going to hold for that for us. But yes, hopefully at some point I will translate for them again.
Fantastic. Do you want to add anything else about Where the Wild Ladies Are? Like, how was your translation process working on it? Even though you did each story sort of over time.
I mean, just really fun, I would say. Like, you know, I think something that I worry about when I tell people that it's feminist retellings of ghost stories is that that doesn't quite convey how much of a joy those stories are to read. And, you know, I think particularly in Japan, where feminism can have quite a kind of academic ring to it and have quite a bad rap, you know, a lot of Aoko's project, I think, I don't want to speak too much for her, but I think a lot of her sort of drive as a novelist is to present kind of ideas in a way that are just really, really enjoyable to read for people of all kind of backgrounds and generations and so on and so forth. And, you know, because they're really fun to read, they are inevitably really fun to translate. Sometimes quite challenging, but yeah, no, it was really good.
Fantastic. Do you, how did translating this book compare to other works you translated? So you've translated a novel called Spring Garden,
Yes.
And I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about that as well.
So Spring Garden is one of 6 novellas that are published by Pushkin Press in their series of Japanese novellas. And it's a book by Tomoka Shibasaki. That was, I guess, the first full-length book that I worked on. And that was a really wonderful experience. It's an extremely atmospheric book, and it kind of, for me, it has a lot of the feeling of a kind of mystery, although actually nothing very dramatic really happens, and yet you're kind of, there's a really wonderful attention to detail, which I loved. And, you know, it was an extremely different thing from translating Aoko. I mean, I think for me, so much of translation, what makes a good translation, what I strive to do in my translations is really to kind of capture a voice and to, you know, learn to inhabit that. And that's a lot what the first draft is about kind of finding that voice. And I think you know, I think my work would be quite boring if I did the same, if I could use the same voice each time. So it's nice to have, it's really great for me to have different, very different works.
Absolutely. Are you working on anything new at the moment?
So I have a book coming out with Bloomsbury in November, which is called There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job, by an author called Kikuko Tsumura. And that, again, is totally different. Really, really quite weird and wonderful. It's all about the world of work, which is not something that I've kind of really translated through before. And yeah, that was also a joy.
Oh, fantastic. I was going to ask about what was my question to do with that? I just thought of it. Oh no, it's gone.
It's okay.
It's gone. It'll come back. Is your process different depending on so like you say with the world of work, there's not a subject almost that you translated around before. Does that mean that your process of translating was quite different from start to finish?
I mean, the process always feels quite different. But maybe it's not the process, and maybe it's more just like the headspace. I mean, I think my process is relatively similar. Most times I translate, which is to go through and produce a hideously rough draft. Like really, almost incomprehensible to anyone else, but somehow kind of doing that almost as fast as I'm reading it. And that somehow, for me, helps to preserve the momentum and the pace of the original text. And then I come back to that and go much, much slower then, and kind of resolve, and that just goes on until it's complete. I mean, I think, with the Bloomsbury book, the jobs book, I had already produced. I pitched that one, so I'd had to work on a sample before, which was one of the 5 chapters, and that was a kind of interesting experience as well. Just polishing one part of it. And so what that meant was that when I came back to it and knew that I was going to be translating the whole thing, I had a kind of model now for the voice that I wanted to kind of use throughout, and that was instructive.
That's really interesting to learn, actually, because it's such a different experience, I think, producing samples. I remembered my question, and it was that I find it quite interesting that you, am I right in saying that you didn't learn Japanese until you were already an adult? Because and so I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I think sometimes it can be sort of the impression that like it's too late. Like if you don't know a language and didn't do it at uni, that it's too late.
Totally, yeah. It's funny for me because I really, really, really never thought that this was the way my life would turn out, or that I would be thought of as a linguist. Like I still don't. That term still fits very strangely with me, even though ostensibly that is what I do, I guess. I mean, I don't really think it's ever too late to do anything, but I agree with you. Certainly with languages, there are, that there is this sense that, there have been times when I thought, well, if you haven't grown up with it, then you can't do it. And certainly if you haven't started learning at a relatively young age. But I guess, I think actually within the world of Japanese translation particularly, there are a good few people who have come to it quite late in life for whatever reason. So yeah, it is possible. If there's anyone watching this who's in doubt, it's definitely possible.
That's really good advice. Thank you. That's come to like the end of the questions I'd pre-prepared, but I would like to reiterate that this is a delightful book and that everyone should be buying it. And I was wondering if there was anything else you wanted to add about Japanese translation in particular. Do you because I've noticed that I definitely have more Japanese books in translation than I think I have any other country's books in translation. And I don't know if that was because I came across Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto and was like, oh, come. But I was also wondering if that's because there's a particular link, or they've just sort of been successful and therefore you've had a little bit more, or am I completely wrong?
I mean, I sort of feel like Japanese culture obviously is very popular in the UK, and that's been the case for a long time. But I think with the kind of fiction that makes it onto people's bookshelves for a long time, you know, it's been very, very dominated by Murakami, and then also by Yoshimoto, and maybe a couple of other names. And I think that and I think now we are actually having a bit of a moment of like people waking up, the publishing industry waking up to the diversity of voices out there. I mean, I would say particularly voices of women writers, but not just, you know, just a real sense of the heterogeneity out there, you know, that like
If you had to recommend some other books for people to find, what would you recommend?
I am a big Yoko Ogawa fan. She writes a really mean short story. I would say the Diving Pool and Other Stories is always a hot recommendation of mine. There's also a translator called Lucy North has translated a book called Toddlers Hunting and Other Stories, which has just been reissued by New Directions, and that's really great. It's slightly older, but it's a really wonderful collection as well. There's so much. Tokyo Ueno Station, also from tiltedaxis Press, is a big, watch it.
Fantastic. Wow. Thank you so much. And
something that I wanted to say before we end is just thank you so much for your wonderful illustration of for the cover. So you produced this beautiful illustration with Himeji Castle, which is featured in one of the stories, and both me and Aiko were kind of enraptured when we saw it, so thank you.
Oh, not at all. I actually had to redo it. I don't know if I think you might have seen the first one too, where Himeji Castle was tiny, because I'd sort of been going more off this front cover,
right.
And Himeji Castle was like this big, and then I redid it and Himeji Castle was like this big. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm glad you liked it.
Sorry, I'm switching over to interviewing you now, but how did the idea come about?
So I did last year when I was working at the Edinburgh Book Festival. Somebody just gave me a chalkboard and was like, "Would you like just write a sign sort of to put on a table for it?" And then I was like, I'd seen, because I'd been at Hay, they have this like long tradition of doing sort of chalkboard like competitions between the stewarding staff who run each festival tent. So they always try and outdo each other with like the most beautiful chalkboard saying what's going on in the tent at the moment. So I'd seen this and was like, right, we can do this here too. We can do this here. So that's how I started doing them, and they just kind of snowballed last year at the festival. And I did sort of quite a lot, like 60 or so. And so then it came around to this year, and I was expecting to do the same, and was hoping to sort of, because getting paid to paint, like, ridiculous.
Yeah.
Best. So I'd expected to do the same, but then obviously the festival got called off, and Hay Festival got called off. So I was sat at home, like at my mum's house, like, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
And I just started doing the Boardless Book Club, and so just was like, oh well, I could do chalkboards for these people, and then sort of that snowballed into like doing chalkboards for sort of novellas or novels, and like each week I was doing like a different chalkboard recommends, and that was translated. So yeah, so it was just part of that. Yeah.
They're lovely. It's such a, and it's like, I don't know, it feels like such a nice record as well of your reading experience, I guess. Decorate a whole house with me.
Thank you. Well, if you want, I can like send you that chalkboard if you want. Aiko, like,
you must keep it as part of your archive.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so there we are. I got interviewed at the end. So thank you so much, Polly. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And bye, everybody.